The afternoon my daughter sat me down and told me she had sold my lake house, I was sitting in a hospital bed recovering from a stroke. She held my hand and explained it carefully, like she was doing me a favor. The market was strong. The upkeep was too much. She had handled everything. I nodded slowly and said nothing. What she did not know was that I had already seen the paperwork. And what she still does not know is that the house she sold was not mine to give. My name is Arthur. For 42 years, that lake house was the only thing I ever owned that mattered. My wife Alina and I bought it in 1982, the year our daughter was born. I taught her to swim off that dock. I taught her to read in the chair by the stone fireplace. 6 months ago, I stood on that same dock and scattered Alina's ashes into the water while my daughter held my arm. And now, from a hospital bed, I was being told that the house was gone, that she had made the decision for me. That it was done. She did not know that I had been preparing for this moment since the day I first saw the way her husband looked at our property. She did not know that the house she sold was never mine alone to give away. And she was about to learn that the father she thought she was protecting had been protecting himself from her for a very long time. I met Alina in 1978, the summer the bottom fell out of the steel market and I lost my first job. I was 26 years old with a degree in accounting and no prospects, and she was a waitress at a diner near the mill who told me I looked like a man who needed a cup of coffee and a better plan. She gave me both. We married in 1980, a courthouse wedding with 12 people and a reception in her mother's backyard. I found work again 6 months later, not in steel, but in commercial real estate. I started as a junior analyst at a firm in the city, $47,000 a year, more money than either of us had ever seen. Alina kept waitressing for the first 2 years while I built my book of business, and on the weekends, we would drive north to the lake and dream about owning something permanent. We found the house in the spring of '82. A cedar-shingled cottage on 2 acres with a boathouse that was half rotted and a fireplace built from river stone. The asking price was $89,000. We had saved just enough for the down payment. I remember Alina standing on the dock the day we closed, her bare feet on the wood, looking out at the water like she had just claimed a country nobody else knew existed. She said, "This is the only thing we ever need to own outright. Everything else can come and go." Our daughter was born that September. We named her Margaret after Alina's mother. We called her Maggie. For the first 10 years of her life, that house was the center of everything. We went up in the summers, on Christmas mornings, on the long weekends when the city felt too heavy. I taught Maggie to swim off that dock when she was 4 years old, her small hands gripping the ladder, Alina laughing from the shore because I was more nervous than the child. I taught her to read in the chair by the stone fireplace when she was 6, the two of us working through a worn copy of Charlotte's Web while Alina made hot chocolate in the kitchen. Those years were simple. I was building my career, not spectacularly but steadily. I moved from analyst to senior associate, then to vice president of acquisitions. By the time Maggie was in high school, I was making more money than I had ever imagined and spending none of it on anything visible. Alina and I had an understanding that went deeper than money. You do not wear what you have, you just have it. We drove the same cars for 10 years. We bought our clothes at department stores. The only thing we ever spent real money on was the lake house. We renovated the kitchen in '93. We rebuilt the boathouse in '97. We replaced the roof in 2004. Every improvement was deliberate, paid for in full, and done with the kind of care that comes from knowing you are building something that will outlast you. Maggie grew up surrounded by that quiet stability, and I believed, in the way fathers believe things without examining them, that she had absorbed our values by proximity, that she understood what the lake house meant, that she understood what it meant to own something outright. I was wrong about that, but I did not find out how wrong until much later. Maggie met her husband Kevin at a fundraiser in 2016. I was there the night they met. I remember thinking he was handsome in the way salesmen are handsome, polished and immediate and slightly too interested in everything you said. He worked in property development, which I learned within the first 3 minutes of our conversation because he mentioned it 4 times. I did not dislike him. I was cautious, which is different. Alina was less diplomatic. After the fundraiser, in the car on the way home, she said, "That young man looks at people the way a contractor looks at a house he wants to flip." I told her she was being unfair. She said she was being accurate. That was Alina. She had a way of seeing through polish that I mistook for cynicism and later understood was clarity. By the time she got sick, I had stopped mistaking it. Elena was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in the fall of 2018. It moved fast the way it sometimes does when the diagnosis comes late and the options are narrow and the doctors start using phrases like, "We can make her comfortable," before you are ready to hear them. Maggie was 26 then, engaged to Kevin, planning a wedding for the following June. She moved the date up to March when we got the prognosis, and Elena sat in the front row of a small chapel in a wheelchair, wearing a blue dress and the necklace I had given her on our 20th anniversary, watching our daughter get married. She smiled the whole time. She died 8 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in May, in our bedroom at home, with her hand in mine. The last thing she said to me was, "Do not let anyone take the lake." I told her I would not. I meant it literally and legally, and in every other way a promise can be meant. I did not understand yet why she felt the need to say it. I understand now. For the first year after Elena died, I kept to myself. I went to work. I came home. I drove up to the lake house on weekends and sat on the dock and talked to her in my head the way widows do, half prayer and half argument. Maggie called regularly. She came for dinners. She told me she was worried about me being alone. She told me Kevin was worried too. They thought maybe I should consider selling the house in the city and moving somewhere with less maintenance. They thought maybe the lake house would be a good full-time option, or maybe the opposite. Maybe I should sell the lake house and buy a condo closer to them. I told them I was fine. I was not fine, but I was managing. What I did not tell them was that in the months after Elena's death, I had done something she had asked me to do years earlier, but I had kept postponing. I had sat down with my attorney and restructured the ownership of every asset we owned, not because I distrusted my daughter. Because Elena had seen something I had not, and grief had sharpened my vision. The lake house was the first thing we addressed. Elena and I had bought it as joint tenants with right of survivorship, which meant when she died, I became the sole owner by operation of law. That was clean, but I knew that if anything happened to me, the house would pass to Maggie through my will, and through Maggie it would pass to her marriage, and her marriage included Kevin. I did not know Kevin well enough to trust him with the one thing Elena had told me to protect. So I sat with my attorney, a man named Marcus who had handled our affairs for 20 years, and we built a structure that was complicated and thorough and anchored in language that no one could challenge without my consent. The lake house was transferred into an irrevocable trust with myself as the primary trustee and Maggie as the successor trustee upon my death or incapacity, but with a condition. The condition was simple. The house could not be sold, transferred, encumbered, or conveyed in any way without the unanimous written consent of 3 individuals. Me, Maggie, and a third-party co-trustee I appointed separately, a man I had known for 30 years and who owed me nothing except a lifetime of mutual respect. If I became incapacitated, the 2 of them would have to agree on any major decision. If I died, the same rule applied in perpetuity for the lifetime of the trust. Kevin could influence 1 person. He could not influence 2. Elena would have approved. She would have said it was exactly the right amount of paranoia. The rest of my assets were structured similarly, but the lake house was the one that mattered. It was not worth the most money, it was worth the most memory, and I had made a promise. I did not tell Maggie about any of this. I should have, I intended to, but the months passed and the conversation never felt right, and I kept putting it off the way people put off discussions about death when they are still grieving one that already happened. That was my mistake. I left a gap, and gaps get filled. Kevin filled it. The first sign came in the spring of 2021, about 18 months before the stroke. Maggie and Kevin came to the lake house for a weekend, and I noticed Kevin walking the property line with his phone out, taking pictures of the shoreline, packing off distances. I asked him what he was doing. He said he was just admiring the place. He said it with a smile. Later that night, while Maggie and I were cleaning up after dinner, she mentioned that Kevin had been looking at comparable sales on the lake. She said it casually, the way you mentioned the weather. I said I was not interested in selling. She said she knew, she just thought it was good to know what we were sitting on. She said we, not me, we. That was the first time I felt something shift. Something small, barely perceptible, the way a door moves when a hand tests the handle. Over the next year, the pattern repeated. Kevin would ask questions that sounded like curiosity but felt like reconnaissance. What was the zoning classification? How were the property taxes structured? Had I considered whether the trust was set up to avoid probate? Maggie would echo him, always gentle, always framed as concern. Dad, we just want to make sure you're protected. Dad, Kevin knows someone who specializes in estate planning for seniors. Dad, have you thought about what happens if you get sick? The word seniors strung. I was 27 years into a career in commercial real estate. I had negotiated property acquisitions worth more than most people make in a lifetime. I had structured deals that went through recessions and market crashes and held value when everything else collapsed. But to Kevin, and increasingly to Maggie, I was just an elderly father with a valuable asset and no visible boundaries. They did not see the structure underneath. I had not shown it to them. And that silence was my fault, but it was also my leverage. Then in early 2022, I had the stroke. It happened on a Saturday morning in the kitchen of the city house. I was making coffee and my left arm stopped working and the world tilted sideways, and I remember thinking Elena would be furious right before I hit the floor. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital bed with tubes in my arm and Maggie holding my hand and her eyes red from crying. The doctors said I had been lucky. The damage was minimal. I would need rehabilitation, speech therapy, physical therapy, months of recovery, but I would recover. Maggie stayed at the hospital every day for the first 2 weeks. She arranged my discharge plan. She found the rehabilitation facility. She told me not to worry about the bills. She had it handled. And I was grateful, genuinely grateful, in the way you are when your child steps up and becomes the adult you raised them to be. What I did not know, in those first weeks of recovery, was that Maggie had already begun to make decisions that went beyond caretaking. She had found the key to my filing cabinet. She had located the deed to the lake house. And she had called Kevin's attorney to ask what would be required to execute a sale. The sale happened on a Thursday in early April, 6 weeks after my stroke, while I was still in the rehabilitation facility learning to walk in a straight line again. They listed the house for just under market value to generate a fast offer. The buyer was a limited liability company registered in Kevin's name. The sale price was $420,000. The deed was signed by Maggie acting under a power of attorney document that I had never seen, never signed, and never authorized. I did not find out about any of this until 3 weeks after it was done. I found out because the county recorder's office sent a confirmation notice to my house in the city, and my neighbor Harold, who had been collecting my mail, brought it to me in the rehabilitation facility along with the rest of the week's pile. I opened it while sitting in a wheelchair next to my bed. I read it twice. I read it 3 times. Then I called Marcus. He answered on the first ring. I told him what had happened. He was silent for a moment. Then he said the words that changed everything. He said, "Arthur, she cannot sell what she does not own. The trust language you signed in 2019 specifically invalidates any transfer made without the co-trustee's consent. She sold a house that was never hers to sell. The sale is void. They just do not know it yet." I sat in that wheelchair with the phone pressed to my ear and the confirmation notice in my lap, and I felt something I had not felt since the morning of the stroke. I felt the ground come back underneath me. I asked Marcus how long it would take to unwind the transaction. He said the legal process would be straightforward, but the human process would not. He asked me what I wanted to do. I told him I wanted to wait. I told him I wanted to see how far they would go. I told him I wanted to give my daughter every opportunity to tell me the truth before I showed her what the truth actually was. She came to visit me that Sunday. She sat down next to my bed, took my hand, and told me she had something important to discuss. I looked at her face, at the daughter I had taught to swim and taught to read, and I saw a stranger wearing her features. She said, "Dad, I need you to understand that what I did for you." Then she told me she had sold the lake house. She used the word simplify. She said the lake house was too much maintenance for someone in my condition. She said the proceeds would cover my medical bills and my long-term care and maybe a small condo somewhere closer to her and Kevin. She said it like she was delivering good news, like she expected me to thank her. I let her finish. I let her hold my hand. I let the silence sit between us for a long moment, the way you let a weight settle before you move it. And then I said, "Maggie, there is something you need to know about that house." The look on her face shifted, just slightly, the way ice shifts before it cracks. I told her everything, not gently, not as a father comforting a daughter, but as a man who had spent 37 years in commercial real estate and knew exactly what a fraudulent conveyance looked like and exactly what the remedy was. I told her that the lake house had been transferred into an irrevocable trust 3 years earlier, the year after her mother died. I told her about the co-trustee, the man I appointed who had known me for 30 years, whose signature was legally required for any sale, transfer, or encumbrance of the property. I told her that the power of attorney document she had used was not one I had ever signed, not one my attorney had ever drafted, and not one that would survive 5 minutes of scrutiny in a courtroom. I told her the sale she executed was void, the deed was legally worthless, and the limited liability company her husband used to purchase the property had just purchased nothing. I told her all of this while sitting in a wheelchair in a rehabilitation facility 6 weeks after a stroke, with a voice that was still slower than I wanted it to be but perfectly clear. And when I finished, I asked her one question. "Maggie, where did you get the power of attorney document?" She did not answer immediately. Her hand withdrew from mine. She stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the parking lot for a long time. The room was silent except for the hum of the heating unit and the distant sound of a nurse's cart in the hallway. When she turned back, her face was a mixture of confusion and something else that I recognized with a father's precision. Fear. She said Kevin had provided the document. He had told her it was standard. He had told her it would allow her to manage my affairs while I was incapacitated, and that this was exactly what families did in these situations. He had brought it to her at the hospital during the first week after my stroke, when she was still sleeping in chairs and eating vending machine crackers and believing every word anyone told her if it sounded like it would help. She had signed her name as the agent. She had not read the fine print because the fine print was 19 pages long and her father was in a hospital bed and Kevin had said it was urgent. I asked her if the document had been notarized. She said yes. I asked her who the notary was. She said a woman named Patricia who worked in Kevin's office and came to the hospital with him. I asked her if Patricia had asked her to swear that the signature on the document was mine. She looked at me with something breaking behind her eyes. She said no. She said Patricia had just stamped it and signed it and left. I nodded. I told her I needed to speak to Kevin. I told her to call him and have him come to the facility the following afternoon. She started to say something and I raised my hand, gently, but final. I told her I was not angry at her. I told her I understood that she had been used and that the people who used her had counted on her exhaustion and her fear to slip something past her. But I told her that the thing they had slipped past her was a felony. Forgery of a power of attorney document is a Class C felony in this state, punishable by up to 10 years in prison and a fine of $100,000. Conspiracy to commit real estate fraud carries another 5 to 10. Knowingly filing a fraudulent deed with the county recorder carries an additional penalty. I recited these things not as a threat, but as a fact, the way I used to recite zoning restrictions to junior analysts who thought they could cut corners. Maggie's face had gone pale. She asked me what I was going to do. I told her that depended on Kevin. That night after she left, I called Marcus again. I told him everything she had said. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I valued about Marcus. When I finished, he told me to hold the phone closer. He said he had already pulled the recorded deed from the county database. He told me the limited liability company that had supposedly purchased the property was registered to an address that matched Kevin's development firm. He told me the deed had been recorded on April 3rd, which meant the 30-day window for filing a notice of defect was still open. He said if we moved quickly, we could have the county recorder flag the title as contested before anyone tried to borrow against the property. And then he said something that made the back of my neck go cold. He said, "Arthur, I checked the property records for the other 2 parcels in your portfolio. There is a quitclaim deed pending on the city house. Filed the same day as the lake house sale, same notary, same attorney. It has not been fully recorded yet because the county flagged a discrepancy in the legal description, but it is sitting in the queue." I asked him what discrepancy. He said the legal description on the quitclaim deed transferred title to a limited liability company that was not the same as the one that purchased the lake house. A different entity, a different address, but both traced back to the same registered agent, Kevin. He had not just sold the lake house. He had tried to take the city house too, and the only reason it had not gone through was because some clerk in the recorder's office had noticed a missing lot number and put it on hold. Marcus said he could file an emergency injunction in the morning. I told him to do it. I told him to file it for both properties. I told him to name Kevin, the notary, and the attorney as respondents. I told him to request an immediate freeze on all transactions involving any property associated with my name or my trust. And then I asked him the hardest question. I asked him if Maggie was legally exposed. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He said technically, she had signed a fraudulent document acting as an agent under a forged power of attorney. That made her a participant in the fraud, whether she understood it or not. But her exposure depended on whether a prosecutor believed she had acted knowingly. If she cooperated, if she testified that she had been misled, if she could demonstrate that Kevin and his associates had orchestrated the entire thing while she was under emotional duress, then she might avoid liability. But it was not guaranteed. I told him I understood. I hung up and sat in the dark for a long time. The stroke had left me with a tremor in my left hand and a slight delay in my speech, but my mind was working the way it had always worked, slowly and methodically, like an engine that takes time to warm up but runs clean once it does. And what my mind kept returning to was not the fraud itself, not the legal strategy, not the money. It was Alina. It was the thing she had said on the drive home from that first fundraiser. That Kevin looked at people the way a contractor looks at a house he wants to flip. She had seen it from the beginning, and I had spent years telling myself she was being unfair. But here I was, sitting in a rehab facility at 68 years old, learning that the man she had warned me about had forged my signature, stolen my house, and nearly stolen a second while my daughter held my hand and believed she was helping me. Alina had been right about everything. I was just slow to arrive at the same conclusion. Kevin arrived the next afternoon at 3 o'clock. He came alone. He was wearing a blazer and an open collar shirt, and he had the same polished, immediate smile I remembered from every other time I had seen him. He walked into my room like he was walking into a negotiation. He shook my hand, asked how I was feeling, said he had been meaning to visit sooner, but things at the office had been hectic. I let him talk. I am good at letting people talk. The more they fill the silence, the more they tell you about what they are afraid of. After a few minutes, I asked him to close the door. He did. I asked him to sit down. He did. I asked him to tell me exactly what had happened with the lake house. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands, and his expression arranged itself into something that looked like concern. He said Maggie had been under enormous stress. He said the medical bills were adding up, and the rehabilitation costs were unpredictable, and she had come to him asking for help. He said he had suggested that selling the lake house made sense, that it was too much for me to maintain now, and the proceeds would secure my care for years. He said the power of attorney document was one that he had used with other clients, perfectly standard, perfectly legal. He said he had assumed Maggie had my consent to act as my agent. He said he had no idea the signature was not mine. I let the silence sit for a moment after he finished. Then I asked him about the city house. I asked him about the quitclaim deed that had been filed on the same day with the same notary, transferring title to a different limited liability company that he controlled. I asked him how many houses he had tried to take. His smile did not disappear, but it stopped reaching his eyes. He said he did not know what I was talking about. I told him my attorney had found the pending deed. I told him the county recorder had flagged it for a discrepancy. I told him we were filing an emergency injunction within the hour. I told him the notary who stamped the document was an employee of his firm, which meant he had personally directed the execution of a fraudulent instrument, which meant he was looking at conspiracy charges, wire fraud charges, and a civil suit that would strip him of his professional license and every asset he owned. I said all of this in the same tone I used to use when explaining to a seller why they were taking my offer. Calm, certain, undisturbed. Kevin's face changed then, the polish cracked. Underneath it was something harder and more calculating, the thing Alina had seen the first night she met him. He said I should be careful about making accusations. He said Maggie had signed the documents willingly. He said the notary had acted in good faith. He said if anyone had committed fraud, it was my daughter, not him. He was already repositioning, already throwing her between himself and the consequences. That is the thing about men like Kevin. They do not protect the people they pretend to serve. They use them and then they discard them, and they do it so smoothly that the person being discarded sometimes thanks them for the opportunity. I told him I was going to give him a choice. I told him that by the end of the week, the fraudulent deed on the lake house would be voided, The quitclaim on the city house would be withdrawn, and every document associated with his scheme would be referred to the district attorney's office. The only variable was whether he went down alone or whether he tried to drag my daughter with him. If he cooperated, if he signed an affidavit admitting that he had directed the forgery, that Maggie had no knowledge of it, and that she had acted solely on his instructions, then I would ask the prosecutor to focus the investigation on him and his associates. If he did not, I would pursue every charge the law allowed against both of them, and I would win, and he would lose everything. I told him he had 72 hours to decide. He sat there, staring at me. The smile was completely gone now. He said he would need to speak to his attorney. I said, of course. I said I would expect his answer by Friday. He stood up. I did not offer my hand. He walked out of the room, and I watched him go, and I knew he would not take the deal. I knew because men like Kevin do not believe they can lose until the judge reads the verdict. And I knew because I had just given him a reason to fight. But what he did not know, and what I had not told him, was that I was counting on his refusal. I wanted him to fight. I wanted him to spend the next several months burning through his money and his reputation and his nervous system while my attorneys dismantled him piece by piece. I wanted him to understand, in a way that would leave a permanent mark, what happened when you tried to steal from a man who had been building structures for longer than you had been alive. Elena had called it. Now it was my turn to finish the job. 2 days later, Marcus called with news. The motion to contest the Lake House deed had been filed, and the property was now flagged in the county system. The quitclaim on the city house had been formally rejected by the recorder's office based on our injunction, and the would-be transfer was dead. The IRS and the state attorney general's office had been notified of potential financial fraud involving a vulnerable adult, which triggered mandatory review under the state's elder protection statute. Marcus said the notary, Patricia, had been contacted by investigators and had already retained her own separate counsel, which meant the conspiracy was starting to collapse inward. He said Kevin had not responded to our settlement offer. I told him I had not expected him to. Marcus said there was one more thing. He had pulled the financial records for the limited liability company that had purchased the Lake House. He said the $420,000 had not come from Kevin's business accounts. It had come from a home equity line of credit taken out against a property owned by someone else. Someone whose signature was on the loan application. I asked him who. He said it was Maggie. Kevin had taken out a loan in Maggie's name, using their marital home as collateral to fund the purchase of a house he was not legally allowed to own, and Maggie had signed the papers. Whether she understood what she was signing or not, she had signed them. I closed my eyes. In my mind, I saw Elena on the dock the day we bought the Lake House, her bare feet on the wood, telling me this was the only thing we ever needed to own outright. I saw her in the wheelchair at Maggie's wedding, wearing the blue dress, smiling through the pain. I saw her in the last week of her life, her hand in mine, telling me not to let anyone take the lake. And now the Lake House was going to come back to me. But my daughter was buried under a mountain of debt and legal exposure that she had not created, but she had certainly signed for. And the man who had put her there was about to find out that I was just getting started. The weeks that followed did not unfold the way I expected. I thought Kevin would lawyer up and drag this out for months, burning through his own money while I methodically dismantled him. But Kevin was not that predictable. Kevin was something worse. He was desperate, and desperate men do not retreat, they double down. The first indication came on a Monday morning, 6 days after I gave him the 72-hour deadline. I was still in the rehabilitation facility working with a physical therapist on a set of parallel bars when my phone rang. It was a detective from the county sheriff's office. His name was Detective Morrison. He said they had received a complaint from a man named Kevin Walsh. The complaint alleged that I had verbally threatened him during our meeting the previous week, that I had a history of emotional volatility following my stroke, and that my daughter was concerned I might be a danger to myself or others. Morrison said it carefully, the way detectives do when they know they are walking through someone else's mess. He said no charges had been filed, but the complaint was on record, and he wanted to hear my side. I leaned against the parallel bars and let the tremor in my left hand settle before I answered. I told him everything. The forged power of attorney, the fraudulent deed, the quitclaim on the city house, the loan taken out in my daughter's name. I gave him Marcus's contact information and the case number from the county recorder's office. Morrison was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mr. Carver, I have been doing this job for 18 years. I have seen a lot of family disputes. I have seen a lot of financial crimes. What you are describing is not a family dispute. It is a criminal enterprise. I am going to open a formal investigation." I thanked him. I asked him if he could notify the district attorney. He said he already planned to. When I hung up, my physical therapist asked if I needed to sit down. I told her I had been sitting for 6 weeks. I wanted to walk. That afternoon, Marcus called with what he called the bad news sandwich. The good news was that the fraudulent lake house deed had been officially voided by the county. The title had reverted to my trust. The property was mine again, legally and indisputably. The bad news was that during the voiding process, the county had discovered something Marcus had missed. Kevin had not just filed one quitclaim on the city house, he had filed 2. The second one had been submitted 3 days before my stroke, before anyone was watching, and it had not been flagged because it was for a different property, not the house itself. The garage. The detached garage at the city house was on a separate parcel number because it had been a separate lot when the neighborhood was subdivided in the 1920s. Kevin had figured out that the garage had its own legal description, its own tax identification number, and its own recording line at the county. He had filed a quitclaim on the garage 3 days before the stroke, and it had sailed through without a single red flag. He owned the garage. He did not own the house. He owned the garage. And because he owned the garage, he had legal access to the property through the driveway easement. It was not the house. It was not the lake house, but it was a foothold. A small, legal, perfectly documented foothold on my land. Marcus said it was the most creative piece of predatory legal work he had seen in 30 years of practice. He said it would take months to unwind because Kevin had technically followed the law on that one document. The signature on that quitclaim was mine. It was authentic. I had signed it 6 months earlier, when Kevin had asked me to sign a routine property tax exemption form that he said would save me a few $100s a year. I had not read the fine print. I had trusted my son-in-law, and I had signed away my garage. I sat with that for a long time, not because the garage mattered in any material sense. It was a 2-car garage with a leaky roof and a family of raccoons that I had been trying to evict since 2015. It had no sentimental value. It had no financial value beyond the land it sat on, but it was the principle. Kevin had gotten a piece of me. He had gotten a piece of me legally, with my own signature, because I had done exactly what I was now blaming my daughter for doing. I had signed something I did not understand because I trusted the person who handed it to me. The only difference was scale. I had lost a garage. My daughter had lost a house, and a lake house, and $420,000 of debt she did not know she was carrying until Marcus told me. But Kevin was not done. The next thing he did was the thing that made the entire situation go from legal to personal in a way I had not anticipated. He called Adult Protective Services. He told them I was a vulnerable adult living alone with no caregiver, that I had recently suffered a stroke and was exhibiting signs of cognitive decline, and that my daughter had been trying to manage my affairs responsibly, but I had become hostile and paranoid. He said I was refusing medical advice. He said I was hoarding money. He said I had accused my own daughter of stealing from me. He said all of this to a social worker named Denise, who showed up at the rehabilitation facility on a Thursday morning with a clipboard and a concerned expression. She interviewed me for 2 hours. She interviewed my doctors. She interviewed the nursing staff. At the end of the 2 hours, she closed her clipboard and said she would be recommending that the case be closed as unfounded. She said, "Mr. Carver, I interview a lot of people in this job. You are not confused. You are not paranoid. You are just angry. And from what I can see, you have every right to be." I asked her if she would put that in writing. She said she would. I asked her if she would send a copy to the detective who was investigating Kevin. She smiled in a way that told me she had been doing this job long enough to recognize the difference between a victim and a perpetrator. She said she would send it wherever I needed. But the investigation had already taken on a momentum of its own. Detective Morrison called again on Friday. He had pulled the incorporation records for Kevin's limited liability companies. There were 7 of them, 7 separate entities registered to 7 different addresses, all with Kevin as the registered agent, each one used for a single transaction before being dissolved and replaced. Morrison said it was a classic shell structure, not illegal on its own. But when you used it to buy and sell properties obtained through fraudulent documents, it became a pattern, and patterns were what prosecutors looked for. Morrison had also found something else. 2 years earlier, an elderly couple in the next county had filed a civil suit against one of Kevin's companies, alleging that he had convinced them to sign over their retirement property under the guise of a tax-deferred exchange. The case had been settled out of court. No criminal charges had been filed. Morrison said the couple had been in their 80s at the time. The husband had since died. The wife was in a nursing home. He said he was reaching out to the wife's attorney to see if she would be willing to testify in our case. He said sometimes these things came down to whether the second victim was still alive to speak. That word, victim, he said it as if it were a fact, and I realized in that moment that this was no longer about the lake house. It was not even about the garage or the city house or the debt in my daughter's name. It was about a pattern of behavior that spanned counties and years and victims. Kevin was not a bad husband who saw an opportunity. He was a predator who had been doing this for a long time, and my daughter had married him. I called Maggie that night. I had not spoken to her since the day Kevin came to the facility. She had been avoiding my calls and I had not pushed. Now I pushed. She answered on the fourth ring. Her voice was thin and guarded. I told her what Morrison had found. I told her about the elderly couple, the settlement, the 7 limited liability companies. I told her the garage was gone. I told her the man she was married to was under active criminal investigation for elder fraud and that he had been running this playbook since before he met her. She was silent for a long time. Then she said the words I will never forget. She said, "Dad, he told me you hit me when I was a child." The world stopped, not figuratively, not as a metaphor. My vision narrowed. The hum of the facility disappeared. The only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat and the sound of my daughter breathing on the other end of the line. I asked her to repeat what she had just said. She said it again. Kevin had told her in the weeks since my accusations began that I had been physically abusive to her when she was young, that my stroke had been caused by years of suppressed rage, that my hostility toward him was just another manifestation of a violent nature she had been too young to remember clearly. He had told her this while holding her, while comforting her, while positioning himself as her protector against the father who had supposedly hurt her. It was a lie. It was an absolute, complete, and demonstrably false lie. But it was the kind of lie that does not require proof. It only requires doubt, and my daughter had been living with doubt for weeks. I asked her if she believed him. She did not answer, and in that silence I understood what Kevin had done. He had not just stolen my property. He had tried to steal my daughter from me. He had poisoned the well at its deepest source, the place where memory and trust and childhood live. And he had done it not to win a legal argument, but to isolate her from the one person who might convince her to testify against him. I told her I was going to say something, and I needed her to listen. I told her I had never laid a hand on her in anger, not once, not ever. I told her her mother would have left me on the spot if I had, and Alina had never been afraid of leaving anything that needed leaving. I told her there were medical records, school records, pediatrician visits, teacher conferences, decades of documentation that showed a healthy, happy, well-cared-for child. I told her that if Kevin's accusation were true, there would be evidence of it somewhere, and I told her to find it. I told her to look for it. I told her to ask anyone who had known our family, anyone who had been in our home, anyone who had ever seen me raise my voice at her. And when she found nothing, I told her to ask herself why the man she married would tell her a lie that could only be designed to destroy her relationship with her father. She started to cry. I heard it catch in her throat. I told her I loved her. I told her I would be here when she was ready, and I hung up. The next call I made was to Marcus. I told him what Kevin had done. Marcus was silent for a moment. Then he said, "This is no longer a property dispute. This is a defamation claim. It is witness tampering, and it is going to make the district attorney very interested in adding charges." He said we needed to move quickly. He said we should file a motion for an emergency protective order that would prevent Kevin from contacting Maggie while the investigation was ongoing. He said we should subpoena the records from the elderly couple's civil suit. He said we should ask Morrison to expand the investigation to include coercive control and domestic abuse. And then he said something I had not expected. He said, "Arthur, you need to talk to your daughter about the home equity loan before Kevin tells her about it, because when he tells her about it, he will tell it in a way that makes you responsible. He will say you forced him to take it." He will say you were squandering money. He will say whatever he needs to say to keep her on his side. You need to get to her first." I knew he was right, but I also knew that telling Maggie she was $420,000 in debt because her husband had used her signature as collateral was not a conversation I could have over the phone. It was a conversation that needed to happen in person, so I did something I had been avoiding. I asked my doctor to accelerate my discharge. I told her I had an emergency at home. She was not happy about it. She said I was still at risk for a secondary event. She said the stress I was describing was exactly the kind of thing that could cause another stroke. I told her the stress would not go away until I had my daughter back and my house back and the man who had tried to take both of them in handcuffs. She signed the discharge papers. She was not happy, but she signed them. I went home on a Saturday morning. Harold, my neighbor, picked me up from the facility and drove me to the city house. The garage was still there, of course. It looked exactly the same as it always had, but now it was not mine. I stood in the driveway and looked at it for a moment, this small, shabby, raccoon-infested structure that had become the legal linchpin of a criminal case. Kevin had won a battle over a garage. He had won it honestly by deceiving me into signing a document I did not read. And I had let him win it because I had been too trusting and too busy and too unwilling to believe what Alina had seen in him from the beginning. But the war was not over. The war was just entering its next phase. Morrison called that afternoon. He had good news and terrible news. The good news was that the district attorney's office had agreed to open a grand jury investigation into Kevin Walsh and his associated entities. They were looking at multiple counts of elder financial exploitation, forgery, conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, and now witness tampering. Morrison said the case was strong. Terrible news was that during the process of serving Kevin with the investigation notice, they had discovered that he had closed the home equity line of credit and transferred the entire $420,000 out of the marital accounts. The money was gone, transferred to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Kevin had taken the money and vanished. He was not answering his phone. He was not at his office. His attorney had filed a motion to withdraw from the case, citing non-payment. Morrison said they were issuing a warrant for his arrest on charges of grand larceny and flight to avoid prosecution. He said they would find him, but he could not tell me when. I hung up and walked into my kitchen, the kitchen where I had made coffee the morning of the stroke, the kitchen where Alina had stood 1,000 times, looking out at the garage. She always said we should tear down and rebuild. I sat down at the table and I tried to think about where Kevin might have gone. And then I remembered something he had said during our meeting at the facility, something that had seemed like an idle comment, but was not. He had mentioned a development project in Costa Rica. He had said it casually, the way he said everything. But now, with the money gone and the warrant pending and the investigation closing in, I realized what it was. It was an exit plan. Kevin had not just stolen my house. He had stolen my daughter's financial future, and he had a place to run. I called Marcus. I told him about Costa Rica. He said he would notify the FBI because the fraud had now crossed international lines. He said we needed to freeze whatever we could find before Kevin liquidated the rest of it. I said I needed to speak to Maggie in person before the authorities found her first. Marcus told me to be careful. He said, "Arthur, she is still married to him. Legally, she is still on his side until she says she is not. Do not assume anything." That night, I drove to Maggie and Kevin's house. I had not driven since the stroke. My left hand was still weak on the wheel, but I drove anyway, slowly, carefully, through streets I had known for 40 years. The house was dark when I arrived. Kevin's car was not in the driveway. I knocked on the front door. Maggie opened it. She was wearing a sweatshirt and her eyes were swollen. She looked at me like I was either her father or a stranger, and she did not know which one I was anymore. I said, "Maggie, I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me in." She stepped back. I walked inside, and for the next 3 hours I told my daughter everything. The loan, the garage, the 7 companies, the elderly couple, Costa Rica, the warrant, the fact that her husband was not coming back and the money was gone and the house she was standing in was about to be foreclosed on because he had not made a mortgage payment in 2 months. I told her all of it. And when I finished, she sat on the couch with her hands in her lap and she did not speak for a long time. Then she looked up at me and said something I will carry for the rest of my life. She said, "Dad, I think I helped him ruin other people too." Because while Kevin had been telling her lies about me, She had remembered something, a couple, an older couple who had come to their office 6 months before the wedding. She had made them coffee. She had watched Kevin walk them through a presentation that she did not fully understand, but that ended with them signing documents. She had thought it was legitimate. She had thought it was his job. But now, hearing about the pattern, hearing about the 7 companies, hearing about the elderly couple in the next county, the memory came back sharp and cold. She had been a witness. She had been a witness to another fraud, and she had not known it until now. I held her while she cried, and then I called Morrison, and I told him my daughter had information that might identify additional victims, information that might put Kevin away for the rest of his life, information that might save someone else's lake house. The investigation that followed uncovered 11 victims across 3 states over a period of 8 years. Kevin had been running his scheme since before he met my daughter, and the only reason he had not been caught sooner was because his victims were old and isolated and ashamed, and none of them had a son or daughter who pushed back. None of them had an Alina who saw him for what he was from the first handshake. None of them had a father who had spent 37 years building structures that held under pressure. But I did, and my structure held, and now it was time for Kevin's to collapse. Kevin Walsh was arrested at an airport in San Jose, Costa Rica, on a Tuesday afternoon in late August. He was attempting to board a flight to Panama with a carry-on bag containing $47,000 in cash, 3 passports in 2 different names, and a laptop that would later prove to contain the financial records of all 11 victims he had defrauded over the preceding 8 years. The arrest was coordinated by the FBI in partnership with Interpol and the Costa Rican Financial Crimes Unit, and it was made possible because Morrison had placed a flag on Kevin's passport and Maggie had told us exactly which development project he had been talking about for months. She gave us the name of the resort, the name of the local attorney he had mentioned, and the approximate timeline of his trips. That information, combined with the FBI's ability to trace the Cayman Islands wire transfer to a bank in San Jose, was enough to put agents at the airport on the day he tried to run. When they took him into custody, he was wearing a linen shirt and sunglasses, and he looked, according to the lead agent, genuinely surprised. That was the thing about Kevin. He believed his own story. He believed he was smarter than everyone else. And for 8 years and 11 victims and nearly $3 million in fraudulent proceeds, he had been right, until he met a man who built structures that held. The extradition process took 4 months. Kevin fought it, of course. Men like Kevin always fight. They hire attorneys who file motions and delay hearings and argue procedural objections that buy time and run up costs. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. My daughter's testimony, the notary's cooperation, the financial records from the 7 limited liability companies, the elderly couple's civil suit, the forged power of attorney document, and now the laptop from Costa Rica, which contained a spreadsheet detailing every property he had ever targeted, every victim he had assessed, and every dollar he had moved. Marcus called it a criminal's diary. Morrison called it a prosecutor's dream. I called it justice. And on January 17, 2023, Kevin Walsh pleaded guilty to 18 counts of elder financial exploitation, forgery, conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, and interstate wire fraud. The plea was negotiated, but it was not lenient. The judge, a woman named Judge Hastings, who had presided over elder abuse cases for 15 years, looked at Kevin during sentencing and said something I will never forget. She said, "You did not just steal property, Mr. Walsh. You stole history. You stole the places where people scattered their loved ones' ashes and taught their children to swim and sat in the evening light and felt at peace. You stole memory, and I am going to make sure you spend a very long time remembering that." She sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison with an additional 10 years of supervised release and ordered restitution in the amount of $2.7 million to the victims whose identities were known. The restitution would come from the assets they had seized, the offshore accounts they had frozen, and the sale of everything Kevin owned that could be legally liquidated. It would not make the victims whole. Restitution never does, but it was something. And in the world of elder financial fraud, where only 5% of reported cases ever see a full or partial recovery, Something was a great deal. Maggie testified at the sentencing hearing. She stood in the courtroom in a navy dress, her hands clasped in front of her, and she told the court what she had told Morrison in the weeks after she remembered the elderly couple in the office. She had been a witness to a fraud she did not recognize at the time. She had been used as a notary, as a character reference, as the smiling wife who made the victims feel safe while her husband took their signatures and their deeds and their retirement savings. She said she had been naive and trusting, and she had ignored the small voices that told her something was wrong. She said she would spend the rest of her life trying to make that right. Judge Hastings listened without interruption. When Maggie finished, the judge told her that she was not on trial, but that if she meant what she said, she would find ways to advocate for the people her husband had harmed. Maggie said she already had. She had started volunteering with a legal clinic that helped elderly victims of financial fraud navigate the civil court system. She was training to become a court-appointed guardian for vulnerable adults. She was doing the work. It was the beginning of a long road, but it was a beginning. After the sentencing, Maggie and I walked out of the courthouse together. It was cold, the kind of January cold that makes your breath visible and your bones ache. We stood on the steps for a moment, looking at the city skyline. She said, "Dad, I don't know how to thank you for not giving up on me." I told her there was never a version of this where I gave up on her, not ever. That was the job. She smiled, a real smile, the kind I had not seen since before Alina got sick. Then she asked me the question I had been expecting. She asked what was going to happen to the debt. The $420,000 Kevin had borrowed against their marital home in her name. I told her the truth. The marital home was not hers. It had never been hers. Marcus had discovered during the investigation that the deed to the house they had lived in for 4 years was fraudulent. Kevin had convinced a widow named Mrs. Florence Archer, age 83, to sign a quitclaim deed transferring the property to an LLC he controlled, claiming it was a tax planning strategy. He had then filed the deed, dissolved the LLC, and transferred the house into his and Maggie's names as a wedding gift to themselves. The woman who had owned the house before them, the real owner, was still alive. She was living in a nursing home in Ohio, and she had no idea her house had been stolen. When Morrison found her, she cried for 20 minutes. Then she asked if she could have her house back. Marcus made sure she got it. The bank that had issued the home equity line of credit was notified that the mortgage was based on a fraudulent deed. The loan was voided. The debt was extinguished. Maggie was not on the hook for a single dollar of it. She sat with that for a moment, standing on the courthouse steps. Then she said, "So I don't have anything." I said, "You have your mother's necklace. And you have me, and you have the lake house whenever you need it." She looked at me with wet eyes. She said she did not deserve the lake house. I told her the lake house was not about deserving, it was about belonging, and she belonged there. She had always belonged there. That was the whole point. 3 weeks later, in February, Maggie moved into the lake house. She did not move permanently. She needed time to rebuild her life, find a job, start the guardianship training, and figure out who she was outside of the marriage that had defined her for 4 years. But she needed a place to land. I told her the lake house had been waiting for her since the day she was born. I drove up with her on a Friday afternoon. The house looked the same as it always had, the cedar shingles weathered silver, the boathouse rebuilt and solid, the dock stretching out into the water. But there was one thing different. The garage. Not the garage in the city, the one Kevin had briefly owned. The garage at the lake house. It had a new door, a new roof. The raccoon family had been relocated by a professional. Maggie asked when I had done all that. I told her I hadn't. I told her that while we were in court, Harold, my neighbor from the city, had driven up and done the work himself. He said he had been meaning to fix it for years. He said he figured I could use one thing that was made better instead of worse. I had not asked him to do it. That was Harold. Some people fill gaps with greed, others fill them with garages. The lake house became a sanctuary again, not just for me, but for Maggie. She spent the spring learning to be alone without being lonely. She swam off the dock in the mornings, even when the water was still cold. She read books in the chair by the fireplace, the same chair where I had taught her to read when she was 6. She cooked dinner in the kitchen Alina had renovated, using Alina's old cast-iron skillet, and she told me she was starting to remember what it felt like to trust her own judgment. I told her that was the thing you lost when someone like Kevin got inside your head. You stopped trusting yourself. You started believing the version of reality he built for you. And rebuilding yourself meant learning to listen to the small voice again, the one that said something was wrong, the one that had been there all along. She asked me if I had ever lost trust in my own judgment. I told her about the tax form, the one Kevin had given me, the one I had signed without reading, the one that gave him the garage. I told her I was a 68-year-old man who had spent 37 years in commercial real estate, and I had signed away a piece of my own property because I was too busy to read the fine print and too trusting to believe my son-in-law would deceive me. I told her the only difference between us was that I had 40 years of practice recognizing when I had been played. And even then, I had still been played. She did not feel better because I said it, but she felt seen. And sometimes, that is enough to start. The garage in the city eventually came back to me. Marcus filed a motion to void the quitclaim on the grounds of fraudulent inducement. Kevin, from his prison cell, did not contest it. The judge signed the order. The garage was mine again. I celebrated by hiring a contractor to tear down the leaky roof and rebuild it properly with a new foundation and a new door and a plaque on the wall that said, "Built in 2023 on a lot that should never have left the family." I invited Harold over to see it. He said it was the most expensive garage he had ever seen. I told him it was the most satisfying. He laughed. He said Linda would have loved the plaque. I told him Linda would have had something specific and pointed to say about Kevin's sentencing. Harold laughed again. He told me to enjoy the garage. I told him I planned to. In June, Maggie went back to the city for a guardianship training seminar. She was gone for a week. The lake house was quiet without her. I walked down to the dock every morning and sat in the same chair Elena used to sit in, the one with the faded blue cushion, and I talked to her, not out loud. In my head, the way I had been doing for 3 years. I told her the lake house was safe. I told her the city house was safe. I told her the garage was safe. I told her our daughter was going to be okay. I told her she had been right about Kevin from the very first handshake, and I was sorry it took me years to catch up. And then I told her the thing I had not told anyone else. The thing that surprised me most about the whole ordeal was not Kevin's greed or his schemes or his eventual arrest in Costa Rica. It was that in the process of protecting the lake house, I had almost lost something more valuable than the house itself. I had almost lost my daughter, not to Kevin, to silence, to the gap I had left between us by not telling her the truth about who I was and what I had built and what I wanted for her. I had spent decades building structures of such complexity that no predator could penetrate them, but I had not spent the same care on the structure of my relationship with my own child. Kevin had been able to get to her because I had not been clear, because I had been private. Because I had worn what I had instead of sharing it. That was my mistake. It would not happen again. Maggie returned from the city on a Sunday evening. She brought groceries and a bottle of wine and a story about a woman she had met at the seminar who had survived a nearly identical fraud. They had exchanged phone numbers. They were going to start meeting monthly. She said she thought maybe she had found something she was good at, something that mattered. I told her I was proud of her. She said she knew. She hugged me, a long hug, the kind she used to give me when she was small. And she went inside and started unpacking groceries, and I stood on the porch and looked out at the lake. The oak tree on the shoreline was coming into its summer fullness. The water was calm. The light was the particular gold that Elena had always said made the dock look like a painting. I stayed there until the light faded, and then I went inside and closed the door behind me. The house was full of the sound of Maggie moving around in the kitchen, the clatter of pots, the smell of something cooking. It was not the same house it had been before. It was better. It was a house that had been tested, protected, and returned to its purpose. It was a house that held the memory of a promise kept, and that was something Kevin could never have taken, even if he had managed to take the deed, because the deed was never what made it mine. What made it mine was the 42 years of mornings on that dock, the woman who stood there with me, the child who learned to swim in that water, the ashes that were scattered on that surface, and the quiet knowledge that I had done what I said I would do. I had not let anyone take the lake, not in any way that mattered. Maggie called from the kitchen. She asked if I wanted pasta or chicken. I said pasta. She said good, because she had already started. I walked into the kitchen where Elena's cast iron skillet was on the stove and the evening light was coming through the window and the table was set for two. I sat down. I watched my daughter cook. And I thought about the morning of the stroke, the moment the world tilted and I hit the floor, and the weeks in the rehabilitation facility, and the conversation with Maggie when she told me she had sold the lake house. I thought about how close everything had come to falling apart. And then I thought about Alina, standing on this same dock in 1982, her bare feet on the wood, telling me this was the only thing we ever needed to own outright. She had been right. But not just about the house. She had been right about something larger, something I was only now beginning to understand fully, that the things we build with care, the things we protect with clarity, the things we share with the people we love, those are the only things that last. The man who tried to steal my lake house is now inmate number 74211 at a federal correctional facility in West Virginia. He will be 61 years old when he is eligible for release. I will be 83. I plan to still be sitting on that dock, still drinking coffee from the same mug, still watching the morning light hit the water the way Alina loved. I do not think about Kevin often. I think about the other 11 victims. Ones whose names I learned during the investigation, but whose faces I will never see. Mrs. Florence Archer, who got her house back, but spent 2 years in a nursing home believing she had lost everything. The couple in the next county who settled out of court and never saw a criminal prosecution. The widow whose husband died before he could testify. There are millions of these stories. $28 billion lost every year to elder financial exploitation. 4 million cases annually. And only 5% of those cases ever see a full or partial recovery of funds. Those are the numbers, but numbers do not capture what is actually taken. What is actually taken is the dock where you scattered your wife's ashes, the kitchen where she taught you how to make her mother's pasta sauce, the chair by the fireplace where your daughter learned to read, the feeling of safety that comes from knowing one place in the world is yours and no one can touch it. That is what predators like Kevin take. And they take it from people who are isolated and grieving and afraid of being a burden to their own children. They take it with a smile and a handshake and a document that looks official enough to pass a cursory glance. Got lucky. I had a 37-year career in commercial real estate and an attorney who had known me for 2 decades and a wife who saw the truth from the very first handshake and wrote protections into a trust before I understood why she was doing it. Most people do not have those advantages. Most people have a paid-off house and a trusting heart and an adult child who seems to have their best interests in mind until suddenly they do not. My daughter was used as a weapon against me. She was used to get access, to get signatures, to get the appearance of legitimacy. And she almost went down with the ship because she did not know any better and no one had ever taught her what a fraudulent conveyance looked like. That is what I want you to take from this story. Not the revenge, not the arrest in Costa Rica, not the satisfaction of watching Kevin realize he had been outplayed by a 68-year-old man in a hospital bed. The thing I want you to take is this. Talk to your parents, talk to your children, tell them what you own, what you owe, and what you want to happen when you are gone. Do not leave gaps. Gaps get filled by people like Kevin. I left a gap between myself and my daughter because I believed that wearing what I had was more dignified than sharing it. That gap was nearly wide enough to swallow my home, my legacy, and my relationship with the only child I will ever have. Do not make that mistake. The structure that saved me was built by a woman who refused to let silence be our family's default setting. Alina insisted on the trust. Alina insisted on the co-trustee clause. Alina insisted that no spouse of our daughters could access the assets without independent legal consent. She did this years before Kevin ever walked into our lives. She did it because she understood that love is not the same thing as protection. Love is what you feel. Protection is what you build. Build the structures, have the conversations, sign the documents, and then sit down with the people you love and tell them exactly where everything is and exactly why it matters. Do not assume they know. Do not assume they will figure it out. Do not assume good intentions are enough. I still drive the same car Alina and I bought in 2009. I still buy my clothes at the same department store. I still walk to the same diner on Tuesday mornings and eat the same breakfast I have eaten for 20 years. Nothing about my life looks different from the outside. And that is the point. The structures that protect you do not need to be visible. They just need to hold. Mine held. And every morning when I walk down to the dock and watch the sun come up over the water, I think about the woman who made sure they would. And I thank her. And then I go inside, make my coffee, and get back to the work of being the man she always believed I was. If this story meant something to you, If it made you think about your parents or your children or the gaps you might be leaving in your own family, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. And when you are done, go call your father. He might have something to tell you that he has been waiting to say for longer than you know.